Dear colleagues, dear students, I have the great pleasure to welcome you today in Aix-en-Provence and on Zoom for the first session of the International Seminar on Social Media Discourse Analysis for the academic year 2023-2024. You know that this seminar is sponsored by 3 universities belonging to the European Civis Alliance, Aix-Marseille Université, Université Libre de Bruxelles, and Stockholm University, and also by Maison Française d'Oxford. Once again, I would like to thank the Lerma Laboratory, which contributes to the funding of the seminar. I am very glad to welcome my colleague, Erin McInerney, from University of Strasbourg and University of Glasgow. I will give you first some information about the format of the session. We will first listen to our keynote speaker. After her paper, you will be able to react and ask questions. During the Zoom session, I will ask you to mute your microphones during the talk. You could switch them on again if you want to ask questions later on. You will be able to ask questions by raising your hands if you are in Aix-en-Provence. If you are online, you can either raise your virtual hands or you can type your questions in the chat window. Erin McInerney is a PhD candidate in linguistics at the Universities of Strasbourg and Glasgow. Her research primarily centers on the notion of Parisian discourse, and she analyzes how individuals make use of linguistic, semiotic, and platform-specific digital resources online to represent themselves and their habitus as Parisian. Her doctoral research investigates this discourse genre and language use more broadly at the Café de Flore Instagram geotag, from which she's building a new corpus of Instagram data for linguists and scholars in digital humanities. The contributions of her participants can be found on Instagram at Corpus de Flore. Her other areas of academic interest include online linguistic landscape and gendered representations of French identity in digital discourse. Erin is also an affiliated researcher at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland, and she's the department head for modern languages at the Strasbourg School of Architecture. In her current research, Erin focuses on the thematic dimensions of identity, online space, and physical space in a study conducted at the Café de Flore Instagram geotag. She analyzes how the texts published by Instagram users contribute to the discursive construction of the cafe's image on and offline. Erin's talk is entitled Playing Parisian, the Discursive Construction of Self and Place at Instagram's Café de Flore. Erin, we're listening to you.
Okay. I think I've got a bit of an echo. All right, I think it's okay. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to begin by extending a very hearty thank you to Grégoire Lacaze for welcoming me so warmly here in Aix. Thank you as well to Grégoire and the other members of the ISSMDA organizing committee for the invitation to speak today and to exchange with those of you present here in Aix and online. I very much look forward to hearing from you and discussing with you further over the next couple of hours we'll be spending together. Who and what is said to be from Paris represents a case study in indexical presupposition. Meanings of Parisian are fluctuating and individually constructed, yet they are somewhat universal in that the Parisian fait social has been consistently shaped by globalized commercial processes. The commodification and pageantries around the notion of Parisian fit squarely within what Goffman has described the function of ceremony. They attempt to craft an affirmation of basic social arrangements and a presentation of ultimate doctrines about man and the world. That being said, I'd like to begin by putting forward my aims for today's presentation. The first of which is to critically engage with what is still an underrepresented platform in our discipline, one that I believe is rife with potential for linguistic and semiotic meaning making. The second is to offer up for consideration and critical reading a specific genre of discourse that has emerged at this geotag, one that I believe offers powerful and surprising examples for the study of digital spaces as they are lived out in real time. And the third is to critically reflect on the theoretical regimes we commonly turn to in analyzing spaces linked by a still nebulous connection, such as the online-offline boundary. In doing so, I would also like to consider how contemporary societies in Paris are reflected in affinity spaces, such as those found on Instagram. And simultaneously, I aim to explore the tensions that are raised by these representations in a society that is increasingly reliant on the commodification and mediatization of everyday life, including something as quotidian and banal as having a coffee. What concrete questions, then, can we ask today to investigate the mise en œuvre of these processes? I propose that we begin working from the stance that individuals on Instagram make use of the platform's networked affordances to produce complex multimodal texts. And by complex, I mean that Instagram posts as texts are, like written and spoken language, composed of syntactic elements, ordered by grammars, and capable of constituting a communicative act like any other speech act, and are therefore as capable, if not more so, of communicating meaning as any other form of written or spoken language. So if we accept this premise, we can consider the two principal questions I pose today. The first of which is how these texts work as active participants in the discursive construction of the Café de Flore geotag. And the second of which examines how individuals' identities are enacted through the embodied performances and mediated practices documented in these mediatized texts. How will we go about answering these questions today? I'll begin by providing a bit of background on the setting in question, and will offer some relevant contextualizing information that will be helpful in the interpretation of the data. Before discussing some of the literature that has been helpful in theorizing this emergent discourse genre, I will also, of course, speak about the methods employed for this study. I'll offer a presentation of the data and a selection of my findings before concluding with some final thoughts. As I have previously stated, I believe that Instagram remains an understudied platform in sociolinguistics and digital discourse. However, today I'll be speaking somewhat less about the platform itself and more about one specific geotag, which is the Café de Flore on the Boulevard Saint-Germain in Paris, located on the left bank of the Seine in the 6th arrondissement. The café was founded in the heart of the Belle Époque period, during which time it often played host to members of Parisian high society and gained recognition for its affiliation with Tout Paris, essentially the equivalent of a modern-day hot or not list for people, places, and things in Paris. The arrival of the 20th century and the tectonic shifts it brought to the world at large were felt in the café, which soon began attracting scores of artists and writers, including surrealists, proponents of Dada, and cultural giants such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Today, Saint-Germain is among the 5 wealthiest neighborhoods in Paris, and although it has played host to different echelons of wealth throughout the last few centuries, its reputation as the noble faubourg, or as a noble quarter, has helped to imbue the café with a certain amount of symbolic prestige going as far back as the 15th century. In the 21st century, however, the café has been rebranded as a destination for Parisian holidaymakers, particularly those seeking to co-opt an authentic, in inverted commas, Parisian aesthetic for their Instagram feed. What you see here are a selection of results taken from a Google search conducted in November 2022 for Instagrammable cafes. Among these articles, which appeared on the first page of results, Café de Flore is mentioned as either the first or second most important cafe to visit. However, beyond the vast contemporary mediatization of the cafe, what was of most interest to me was the cafe's highly visible choice to align itself with this newfound Instagrammable identity, demonstrated here on its main website with the assertion Instaflore, despite its already historicized elite status. With this in mind, I'd like to present 4 key processes many sociolinguists consider to be at work in complex texts such as these, and subsequently reflect on how they can be mobilized by individuals to self-representative ends. I'll begin with that of intextualization, defined by Richard Bauman and Charles Briggs in 1990 as the process of rendering discourse extractable, of making a text that can be lifted out of its interactional setting. In other words, intextualization is the process by which discourse is rendered decontextualizable. And as Sirpa Lepenin and colleagues have suggested, with intextualization in our analytical toolkit, it becomes possible to investigate how social media participants, through extracting instances of culture, language forms, textual or other semiotic material, and relocating them in their discourses and repertoires, perform identity at the grassroots level of social media activities. Particularly in a multimodal discourse setting, intextualization is often presented alongside the process of resemiotization. And although it is important to note that these were theorized in different fields, anthropology and social semiotics respectively, the two work rather well as complementary frameworks for the analysis of multimodal texts. Resemiotization considers how meaning is decontextualized and recontextualized in the shifting materialities used by individuals to communicative ends. In other words, while intextualization appeals to the intertextual knowledge of a speaker's interlocutor, resemiotization relies on the diachronic knowledge of the audience or on the enregisterment of symbolic meaning. Consequently, intextualization can be considered, and here I quote Bauman and Briggs, as an act of control, and in regard to the differential exercise of such control, the issue of social power arises. 2 other closely related processes are that of remediation and mediatization. My use of the term remediation aligns with Thurlow and Jaworski's assertion that all communicative acts are made within a semiotic frame, and that the proliferation of digital media offers individuals the boundless opportunities and tools to continually remake, revamp, and relive the communicative acts formed offline. Mediatization, as a process of commoditization upon a process of communication, is omnipresent in both societies afflicted by the neoliberal condition and in the literature that sets out to study them. Androtsopoulos in 2014 suggested that mediatization is the process by which an online nexus emerges. More recently, Dreux-Busset has described it as one of the most transformative processes in high modernity, along with globalization, urbanization, secularization, and individualization. I've also realized that this reference here, it's in press, it's 2024, not 2014, so please excuse that oversight. How then can we point to some of the ways we can anticipate these processes to materialize in the data? We know that users strategically implement consistent strategies across the different semiotic modes made available by Instagram's stylistic affordances to enact a personal brand that bolsters their online persona. We also know that traveling is a long-standing embodied tradition, during which tourist sites are frequently the subjects of mediatized representations, mediated actions, and remediated practices. The individual and their brand are therefore inserted in these processes. And thus, a dichotomy arises as canonical tourist spaces in Paris are eschewed in favor of spaces that boast authentic identities, which are then mobilized as commodities in the user's quest for the performance of an elite authenticity. And so, if the task of multimodal discourse scholars is to empirically discover what means are available in a given social setting, to whom they may be available, and under what circumstances for making discourse into a text, we must adapt our methodological tools to suit these circumstances. Instagram is a notoriously complex platform with stringent guidelines for data collection. A lack of familiarity with the platform and questions about how to approach research on it thus abound across the various fields that connect us. This is demonstrated here by a recent exchange on the Association of Internet Researchers server. In the exchange, a member asks for tools that her PhD student conducting a study on Instagram might use to gather posts related to a specific hashtag. Another user responds that the only tool he is aware of is one produced, monitored, and restricted by Instagram's parent company, Meta. What I aim to illustrate here is that even among one of the most visible and productive groups of internet scholars, there is little to no information available about the ethical or legal approaches to procuring data on Instagram, and the existing tools raise significant concerns in regard to the monitoring of data and platform governance. In large part, discussions on ethical Instagram research have focused on 4 recurrent issues: questions on the public-private binary, restrictions related to Instagram's bylaws, limitations related to the informed consent and anonymization of research participants, and debates surrounding data storage and dissemination. We generally understand that the designation of data as public or private on social media platforms is not a sufficient measure of what truly constitutes public data, nor is it a measure of participant consent to research. We also know that to date, Instagram does not forbid research conducted on the platform. It does, however, forbid individuals from accessing or collecting information in unauthorized ways, stipulating that this includes creating accounts or collecting information in an automated way without their express permission, meaning that the API cannot be used to scrape data from the platform, perhaps as is done on other social media platforms. The final 2 issues evoke legal questions surrounding the right, data privacy, and authors' rights. Therefore, in my aim to devise a methodology that took these under consideration and that would be well suited to Instagram, I found that definitions of social media websites lean unequivocally on the notion of user-generated content to achieve their explanation. One of the claims I have been making is that this term, it constitutes an underdefined process in the field of digital discourse, and that digital discourse scholars must consider the specific features that differentiate user-generated content on one platform from that on another. My research identified 3 principal affordances that I believe distinguish Instagram user-generated content from other social media data, which I refer to as its adjustability, shareability, and multimodality. These 3 features provide Instagram users with a means to assert their autonomy and perform their identities. Consequently, they are crucial factors to Instagram's draw as a research site. However, these 3 features are also responsible for regularly cited issues in Instagram research. Shareability can render it difficult for scholars to clearly identify the original corresponding author of a post, while adjustability and multimodality may blend the work of a number of corresponding authors into a single post, whose discrete parts are not fully evident. Adjustability is also responsible for extensive changes that a dataset may undergo on Instagram. Posts can be altered, edited, even removed altogether once uploaded to the platform, raising critical ethical questions about how the evolution of data should be broached by researchers. Indeed, one of the most characteristic features of Instagram data lies in its nature as a fluid, changeable object. Changing data, such as edited post captions and the addition or removal of posts from the platform, pose concerns that affect the full spectrum of a research design, including data collection methods. I consequently devised 3 guiding principles for this research project that took into account Instagram's platform-specific affordances, as well as its ethical and legal limitations. Prior to analyzing my data, I adopted a user-centric approach to my data collection phase, which is to say that I aimed, insofar as possible, to exercise community norms and make use of platform vernaculars in my communications with Instagram users. And while I did not conduct a digital ethnography, you can perhaps smell a slight ethnographic influence seeping into that stance. During my data collection and analysis, which were performed concurrently due to the iterative nature of the project, I sought to follow the cues of the platform by exhausting the maximum number of features offered by Instagram to enrich my methodology, track changes to the data, and minimize the time data was stored on an external drive. Following data collection and analysis, it was of great importance to me to involve users in the data dissemination phase, not only because this may be required by publishers or for research output, but because I truly conceived of this project as one that was co-constructed. However, doing so has had the added benefit of generating supplementary data for future research. This phase of pre-research and the reflections that ensued have quite literally spanned multiple years of my life. But when people ask me about my methodological approach, I do realize they don't always have that kind of time to dedicate to the response. So I recently attempted to distill it in a kind of quick and dirty headline, which, albeit oversimplified, I think does manage to convey my stance relatively well. So I borrowed from the principle of energy conservation and would offer this tidbit to any of you who are toying with the idea of dipping your toe into a research project conducted on Instagram. And that is that Instagram data is best understood as something that can be neither lost nor destroyed, simply changed. Prior to collecting my data, I created an academic profile on Instagram on which I identified myself as a researcher and with which I linked my professional affiliations and my previous academic work. I then created a profile specific to the research project that users can consult when I contacted them to gain a better understanding of the study's aims and to provide greater legitimacy to the project. I also regularly employ networked features such as stories and reels on my academic page to update users about where their data is being presented and how it is being used along different steps of the project. To collect data, I first created a private collection within my professional Instagram account for every month during which I intended to gather data. Once created, I added all relevant posts from the month of collection to the album on my account where they were saved, allowing me to consult the data and track changes to the dataset without extracting it from the platform. My project gathered every post tagged at the Café de Flore geotag on the first day of the month of the year 2022. I continued to analyze the data and monitor changes it underwent over the course of the year before extracting the final data set on December 31st, 2022. In addition to the Save feature's use as a tracking and storage tool, Saves also offer researchers with an opportunity to communicate a tacit thank you to users, as Saves are generally considered to be the most productive genre of engagement for Instagram's algorithm. My final data set counted 415 posts. 7 of these were excluded for having either no visible language in the caption and no text in the photo or video, or indiscernible proximity to the cafe, and these were largely photos and videos taken in homes or private residences. This left me with a total of 408 posts, and this is the corpus of data I am presenting to you today. So just to refresh your mind after all of that about the two specific questions we're looking at today, to answer this first question, I adopted a virtual linguistic landscape, semiotic landscape approach, of which you can see some related literature here if you are unfamiliar with this field. Using this approach, I analyzed the data gathered from the geotag, investigating the linguistic and semiotic diversity present in all genres of visual signage, meaning the photos or videos in this primary semiotic element area, and the caption, which may or may not have included hashtags. I did not analyze comments on the posts. Examining linguistic landscape online allows researchers to reconsider how symbolic forces, such as those at work in Saint-Germain, are materializing in new ways online to construct public space. One of the primary variables I sought to pinpoint with this analysis was that of dominant perspective. And by dominant perspective, I refer to both the cover photo of an Instagram post, meaning the first photo that one would see, or the cover photo of a video, the one that's selected by the user, as well as the primary semiotic material contained in that image and the perspective employed to capture it. And these are salient for a few specific reasons. Cover photos are highly emblematic of the platform at large. They are displayed on a geotag's landing page or on an individual user's profile, and they are very often the first element with which users come into contact on Instagram. The creation of a dominant perspective constitutes a highly visible creative process, and it is fair to assume that Instagram users are widely aware of this visibility. Indeed, I consider dominant perspective to be one of the most useful tools we have in studying how a geotag is constructed from a micro all the way to a macro perspective. The semiotic analysis of these data found 4 dominant perspectives, which I present here in order of frequency. The first of which were tabletop and flat lay scenes, of which there were 188 in the corpus. In this arrangement, a Café de Flore tabletop setup constitutes the primary scene of the photo or figures prominently in the photo. This perspective was principally characterized by bird's eye view or flat lay shots, as you can see on the bottom here, table level shots, and straight on shots. The second dominant perspective was that of Café de Flore storefront scenes, of which there were 166, in which the Café de Flore storefront is depicted as the main object or central backdrop of the photo. These were characterized by close crops, straight shots, high-angle shots, and most frequently images of the east-facing side of the cafe's facade, which you see in the third and the first photo. The third dominant perspective was exterior scenes not depicting the cafe's storefront, of which there were 25, characterized largely by straight-on shots and wider crops, and the final was interior scenes other than tabletop, of which there were 23, some more surprising than others, characterized by fairly wide crops and eye-level shots. So if there are any mathematically minded among you, I'm certainly not one of those people, but you may have noted that 7 posts are missing from this list. These posts contain photos of businesses other than Café de Flore or other street signs. And for the sake of time, I won't be reviewing them today, but you can view them in this table here. And as we take a look at this data, we notice that across different mediums, from different angles, and through the different lenses of this study's participants, the Café de Flore brand asserts itself resolutely in these findings. 379 of the 408 posts depicted at least one complete or partial token of branded material belonging to the cafe. Its dominance resonates profoundly across the data, and it is unequivocally one of the most defining features of this corpus. The dominant perspectives presented here offer a very real indication that both the linguistic landscape of the physical cafe and the online linguistic landscape of the geotag are tremendously influenced by the ensemble of branded material provided by the cafe. The formidable presence of the Café de Flore brand in photos and videos suggests that the cafe's online linguistic landscape retains a number of similarities with its linguistic landscape offline. Otherwise stated, while the Instagram geotag does not provide a comprehensive or analogous representation of the cafe, the most salient semiotic components of its physical landscape are preserved. Visually, Café de Flore thus emerges as a mainstay of the corpus's semiotic material. However, it is not only a central agent in the visual discourses of these individuals. In addition to the geotag, Café de Flore is lexically reinforced in 171 post captions. Meanwhile, 273 post captions contain at least one instance of the lexical tokens Paris or Parisian, compared with only 54 posts containing French or France. These stylistic choices intimated that the discursive construction of the cafe relied heavily on users' relationships with the space they occupied, but equally so, it relied on users' beliefs about the cafe's relationship to and with its multiple settings. What emerges is a clear portrayal of the cafe as Parisian rather than French, as situated in Paris rather than France, and as a commodified status symbol in name alone. And for this reason, it is indeed tempting, even reasonable, to consider that the frequency of the cafe's appearance in the photos and videos of this corpus and the numerous materialities employed to carry it are directly correlated with the brand's market value offline and on Instagram. Users relied considerably on stereotypical mainstays of French cafe culture to constitute their images, regularly introducing croissants, baguettes, and hot drinks of all sorts into the frame. Tabletop scenes were thus understood to be highly curated and to contain a larger number of pre-selected, pre-positioned elements than storefront scenes. Both perspectives, however, were anchored and linked by the presence of Café de Flore's insignia. The cafe's branding, which extends to items as slim as napkins and as compact as sugar cube wrappings, forms a nexus of homogeneity between the images and the corpus. The Café de Flore branding suite exerts a palpable sense of linguistic dominance through the sheer force of repetition and number in the corpus, largely drowning out any other visual language that occupies space inside and immediately outside the cafe's walls. And while some Instagram users had notably centered these elements as a grounding thematic force in their photos, such as the one illustrated on the right, the total collection of photos and videos taken at Café de Flore also conveys the considerable difficulty of obscuring these branded objects, even in an online context. By enacting a comprehensive branding strategy across a variety of mediums, Café de Flore wields control over the discursive construction of its own linguistic landscape and ensures a certain uniformity across the geotag's landing page. The visual stability brought about by this ubiquitous branding thus immediately draws attention to any post that does not comply with these norms, painting it as an infiltrating, disruptive force. So using this selection of data to respond to the first guiding question, I suggest that these texts use the platform's networked affordances and remediating opportunities to construct the cafe as a quintessentially Parisian destination, yet one that is doused in accessories that are equally emblematic of France at large and of numerous other countries and cultures coexisting in a globalized society. Indeed, viennoiseries are called as such because they don't originate in Paris. Building on this ostensible Parisian prestige, Instagram posts further emphasize the symbolic value of the cafe by grounding its branded paraphernalia as a central figure in their posts and videos. And while Instagram's photo and video sharing features allow the authors of these posts to assert their creative authority in the mediatization of the cafe, What we in fact bear witness to is the cafe's ability to exercise a level of control over its own online representation, which is achieved by flooding an individual's offline semiotic environment with branded objects and mediators of the cafe experience. What then can be said about the embodied performances of post authors at the cafe and the enactment of their identities in these texts? Among these mediated practices, we can speak both of language use and languages used in the corpus's captions. A total of 24 languages were detected in the post captions of this corpus, presented here alphabetically. Users frequently relied on English and French, as well as on a combination of 2 or more languages to craft their post captions, which ranged in length from 1 word to the maximum 2,200 characters allowed in the caption space by Instagram. This linguistic diversity does not so much construct the cafe as a multilingual business or institution, but rather allows us to begin constructing an image of the cafe goers. Robert Blackwood at the University of Liverpool has suggested that on Instagram, an individual's use of text to assert a specific identity is reinforced by a multilingual axis, where often, but not always, speakers use a range of languages, usually English in their mise en scène, in order to present themselves as mobile global citizens. This already implicit depiction of mobility here was rendered further explicit through users' layering of different multimodal strategies to craft their online personas. Among the tactics employed to accomplish this performance of mobility was the emphasis on the individual's proximity to the city of Paris. As I have already pointed out, over half of the posts in the corpus made at least 1 explicit reference to Paris in their caption. However, only rarely did these 207 posts contain 1 sole linguistic or indexical resource pointing to the city. As illustrated here, the act of indexing Paris and of indexing oneself with Paris was principally a linguistic process. Repeated instances of the lexical token Paris, placed here at the head of the post caption, are also employed in the sequence of hashtags situated below it. Peeling our way through these various iterations, we see how this user and other individuals in the corpus employs the utterance as both a noun and functionally as an adjective, such as in Paris Café. Although in English, Parisian would typically be the most applicable term in this sense. And this is likely one reason for which the number of instances of Parisian is not higher in the corpus. Amidst these series of linguistic decisions, we also observe that English is mobilized to highly performative ends. English hashtag sequences, such as the one depicted here, are frequently employed by users of Instagram to draw traffic to their posts, rather than to participate in a larger hashtag conversation, as was previously the platform norm on Twitter. The slew of densely compressed Paris-adjacent hashtags that appear in the corpus provide an indication of their market value on the platform as a linguistic and symbolic resource, enabling individuals to affiliate themselves with an already highly commodified identity and contribute to its dominance through further mediatization. We can also observe in this data sample a recapitulation of the strategies and arrangements I've spoken about previously today, including the use of the Café de Flore storefront, the use of a close crop, which eliminates competing signage, the intextualized semiotic resource to indicate location and demonstrate proficiency in platform vernaculars. Indeed, the identity and mobility of these individuals was also accomplished at the discursive level, not only at the lexical level, as individuals self-positioned as reliable narrators through the sociolinguistic phenomenon of stance-taking. The fundamentals of stance-taking are described by Jaffe in 2009 as taking up a position with respect to the form or content of one's utterance. And as Jaffe expounds, the act of stance-taking is fundamentally intertwined with the notion of positionality, which is to say that speakers invariably position themselves in relationship to the utterance in question, those present for the utterance, those who will eventually come into contact with the utterance, and the context of the utterance. I sought to investigate this phenomenon vis-a-vis my building claim that the multimodal discourse crafted by individuals at this geotag constructs a Parisian persona for both the cafe and the cafe goers. The user's geographical position now having been well established, we can consider how the multimodal resources that appear in these photos continue to serve as legitimizing mechanisms, while linguistic resources are manipulated to frame the user as an authority on the tourist experience at Café de Flore and more broadly in Paris. Throughout the corpus, users self-position as expert narrators. Situating themselves as purveyors of information, these individuals market their knowledge as a commodity of value within their online communities. This performance of stance-taking is enacted through two principal genres of narrative in my corpus, the first of which I term narratives of lecture, which are illustrated here. If it's difficult to read, I'll go ahead and read that post on the left. Café de Flore would probably not exist if it wasn't for the dozens of writers who passed through its doors day after day, year after year. For almost 50 years, this place was the place for literary meetings, philosophical debates, and artistic daydreams. To begin with, it must be said that, in the first few years, Café de Flore did not have a great importance. It was just a coffee shop like any other, and did not attract many people. That's probably why we don't know the actual opening date of the place. 1884, 1885, 1887. The year 1885 will be chosen later, perhaps to coincide with the opening of its longtime neighbor and competitor, Les Deux Magots. Narratives of lecture were characterized by a stance of authority on the historical attributes of the café and the significance of its cultural renown. Discourse markers for this genre include use of the third person, frequent use of adjectival lexical tokens which index prestige, such as literary, historical, and intellectual, and limited use of qualifying language. Individuals imbue their posts with these resources, imparting knowledge that can be measured by true-false indicators, through which a professional, authoritative register ensues. Contrastingly, narratives of insider knowledge were marked by use of first-person and second-person perspectives, such as I recommend and you have to, through which a user constructs a sense of closeness and familiarity with his or her audience. Metadiscursively, these narratives convey a sense of lived experience to the audience, often indicating hack-style tips of information, such as how to prepare for one's visit, what to eat and what to drink, and how to distinguish their visit as an authentic, once again in inverted commas, Parisian experience. And this discourse was marked by a reliance on largely effective lexical and semantic features to produce relatable overtones and an air of approachability and trustworthiness. In both scenarios, these practices crossed linguistic and cultural boundaries to assert themselves, offering up clues about the community norms formed within the platform and at this specific geotag. Users depict themselves as being in possession of knowledge that is unequivocally linked to the experience of visiting the cafe. In other words, an individual's proximity to a specific Parisian experience enables them to transcend from the exhibition of one layer of social capital, which is performing this proximity, to the production of another, in which they publicly demonstrate their capacity to advise on Parisian history, culture, and tourism. This recalls Thurlow and Jaworski's suggestion that embodied tourist practices consist of knowing and reproducing cultural heritage, in which the recycling of mediatized sources serves as a verification of the facts and positions of the speaker as a knowing subject. Indeed, push for regimes of authenticity in the tourism industry and on Instagram have been well established. As Monica Heller and colleagues state, language is both a means of attributing authenticating value to the tourist product, as well as a means of selling it. This raises the question of whether the selling process is also to be framed as a performance of authenticity. I propose that this era of authenticity is further embodied by users at Café de Flore through the performance of flânerie. Offline, the embodied act of flânerie implies wandering without a goal or destination for the simple pleasure of taking in one's sights. In the corpus, performance of flânerie reinforces an image of the Parisian as an able-bodied person, and as you have undoubtedly noticed, most often an able-bodied woman, whose privilege or status enables her to enact mobility in elite spaces. Flânerie is most frequently enacted through spontaneous crosswalk shots that convey a sense of ambivalent inertia and directionless wandering, cradled by a very which loads significance onto what is in reality a rather mundane activity, walking or simply commuting. But the performance of this pastime invokes numerous layers of privilege, such as the mere freedom to take the time to meander and the means that accompany this freedom, but also communicates a mise en oeuvre of cultural capital through cultural awareness. Flânerie is indeed a heavily loaded cultural practice. It implies a presence in certain quarters and not in others, in spaces that provide activities, surroundings, and infrastructure conducive to the act of flânerie, such as manicured streets, marked by a certain cleanliness and order, dotted with storefronts, shops, cafes, and other quasi-neoliberal institutions that encourage some sort of frivolity. Goffman has suggested that displays very often have a dialogic character of a statement reply kind, with an expression on the part of one individual calling forth an expression on the part of another. The organizational antiphonal structure of the multimodal material in this corpus very much echo these words from Goffman and suggest that we can indeed uncover reigning principles of coherence with which the discourse at Café de Flore in 2022 was aligned. I'd like to conclude with some final thoughts to answer the two principal questions posed today. My findings suggest that while the making of the Instagram geotag is an iterative process undergoing constant reconstruction, Café de Flore stands resolute as the most consistent and powerful actor across this discourse genre. Building on the sociocultural, historical, and symbolic prestige of the quarter and the city of Paris, Café de Flore dictates its control over its online semiotic and linguistic landscape through the manipulation and emplacement of branded physical resources at its residence on Boulevard Saint-Germain. Individuals' discourse about Paris, about themselves in Paris, and about their status as Parisian is achieved through the deployment of linguistic, semiotic, and multimodal resources, indicating proximity to the city and containing expertise about how to best experience it. Together, these illustrations provide a rigid, narrow, and elite genre of Parisian habitus. And as Instagram users engage in this act of stance-taking, they map their own identities, languages, and interpretations onto the Parisian archetype. What in fact appears in the data largely reinforces dominant narratives about Parisians as an identity group. However, it is necessary to recall how these visions are manipulated by algorithms that privilege standard forms of discourse over the voices of dissenting individuals. And as we look to future research and continue to posit the relationship between the online-offline nexus, I suggest that a coherent way forward for those of us concerned with computer-mediated communication would be to consider how the semiotic landscapes of digital environments engage with the theoretical paradigm of platformization, defined here by Nieborg and Powell as the penetration of digital platforms' economic, infrastructural, and governmental extensions into the cultural industries, as well as the organization of cultural practices of labor, creativity, and democracy around these platforms. In regard to this corpus, platformization allows us to reconsider how Instagrammability has the power to resurface an online linguistic landscape and portray it as both a cultural and transcultural commodity. A common sense view of Paris sells the city as something you must be mobile to experience, while instacultural tourism portrays Parisian identity as something appropriated through finite, specific patterns of consumption. Mediatization thus emerges as a critical actor in the making of Parisian discourse and in the everyday construction of contemporary societies transnationally. An individual's visit to this one institution unlocks access to discourse about other institutions, suggesting that one of the types of capital the cafe affords is its capacity to work as a symbolic gatekeeper, both within the plane of Parisian tourism online and on a broader scale, given the prestige associated with the city and its status as one of the most desirable tourist locations worldwide. Act discourse on a grand scale, individuals are forced to turn to networked environments if they wish to engage in stance taking outside of their physical social networks. What I've attempted to illustrate is that niche discourse genres, such as the one I've presented today, hold countless implications for how existing mythologies are further entrenched in society despite the ostensible democratization that is supposed by some to accompany participatory culture. Lefebvre has suggested that in reality, social space incorporates social actions, the actions of subjects, both individual and collective, who are born and who die, who suffer and who act. From the point of view of these subjects, the behavior of their space is at once vital and mortal. Within it, they develop, give expression to themselves, and encounter prohibitions. Then they perish, and that same space contains their graves. What remains to be seen is how these networked environments will speak to our use and commodification of cultural spaces, places, and identities as time moves forward. One thing, however, is certain. Our lives and livelihood are deeply intertwined with the prohibitions, social actions, suffering, and expression selected, sorted, ordered, and disseminated to us by these platforms, which in only a short time may come to know more about us than we know about ourselves. So thank you very much for your attention today. And if you're curious to follow along with the project, you can do so at Corpus de Flore on Instagram. And I hope to have uploaded the complete corpus sometime in the early spring.
Thank you very much, Erin, for your brilliant and fascinating presentation. I think all of us will have a lot of questions for you. So please, who would like to start questions, either in the chat or in Aix-en-Provence?
I'm going to try to get this.
So
I'll keep my sound on. Okay. Yeah.
Who would like to start a question? Julia?
Yes, can you hear me? No. Can you hear me?
We're listening to you, Julia.
Oh, okay. So my question is, how did you have the idea to work on the Café de Flore?
Okay, thanks. Sorry, this is quite strange. Okay.
Just
There's
a second.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Julia, for your question. Sorry, we have a few echo issues here. It's a bit of a long story. I got into sociolinguistics through kind of vague phonology background. And one of the things that I was really interested in is a there's a French American, there are two influencers that I followed out of curiosity, one who's Franco-British and one who's Franco-American. And I saw that the Franco-American influencer very, very frequently changed the way that she spoke in English and began to add a lot more phonological features that were indicative of French. And I started to wonder about the sort of symbolic value of these features. And that's what got me into this idea of the marketability of the Parisian. And then when it came to where to study, I was interested in fixating on a specific location in Paris where tourists and locals, quote unquote, would be likely to kind of meet and intersect. And having looked specifically at the mediatization of the Café de Flore and its newfound Instagrammability, it's often been written about as the most Instagrammable cafe in Paris. It seemed like the very, very much an ideal choice, considering that I wanted to also conduct a study on Instagram. Keeping in mind, I started this research during the pandemic, so it was my intention to do that anyway, but I also had to create a study that can be conducted fully online, pardon me.
Thank you for your question, Julia. Who's got another question?
I hope my computer doesn't die.
I have another. Yes. Sorry, I don't know how to raise the hand on Zoom, so I just.
Honestly.
I was wondering, how do you think a location becomes fashionable on Instagram, and why this place became a sociolinguistic influence within the Instagram world? Why this cafe, not another one, for example?
It's such a good question. I've asked myself a version of this question multiple times. Just excuse me 1 second while I plug in my computer because it might die. So yes, why this cafe and why not, for example, Les Deux Magots, which is also very famous and located, I think it's something like 50 meters down the street from Café de Flore.
And
research
so
would tell me that it's
Paris.
largely because the Café de Flore is perhaps, at least in the Anglophone world, a bit more well-known than Les Deux Magots. And so it's more regularly featured in feature articles, such as travel articles by Sea & Traveler, the New York Times, or something similar to that. So it was already mediatized, I would say, on a baseline level in the international Anglophone media. But what I found was that Café de Flore really began leaning into this identity. So what I gathered data from was the geotag, but Café de Flore also has an Instagram account where it reposts everything that's, well, not everything, but most everything that's tagged there. It also very frequently interacts with users. So it likes the content that's tagged with the geotag. It will respond to users. And this, of course, is something that is preferred by the algorithm. So the more activity that's happening at that specific space, the more likely the algorithm is to recommend it to people who are looking at that type of content. And because similar cafes hadn't been engaging at that level or hadn't had that level of baseline engagement due to historical significance, they have perhaps fallen a bit under the rug. But that would be my presupposition or my conclusion after having gathered data. And also, there's a slight influence as well from the Emily in Paris series, which debuted during my data collection process. And Emily is a character that lives in the 5th arrondissement and Café de Flore is in the 6th arrondissement, and she goes to the cafe in one of the episodes of the first season. And since it's been written about in the New York Times as well, so there's a whole other wave of mediatized talk or discourse about the cafe because of this new level of mediatization, which is very interesting as well because there's a heavy use of Instagram in that series. So that would be my response.
Yeah, I saw, in fact, also there was I don't know if you heard about it, that bakery in France that was broadcasted on Emily in Paris season 1 or 2, I can't remember. And in the end, so Café de Flore was lucky, but this bakery wasn't that lucky because they had in the end a bad advertisement, because there was such this huge movement around it on social media, and it features in Emily in Paris. So, oh my gosh, the croissant and the pain au chocolat look so good. And in the end, it's just a French bakery. It's not, there's nothing that can go on social media on it. It's just a simple bakery.
You're absolutely right. And I have actually conducted another study on that specific geotag. So at the Boulangerie Moderne and at the place where Emily is said to live, and also at the Italian restaurant in the series, which are all within about 300 meters of each other in the 5th arrondissement. And I can absolutely confirm that on Instagram, all of the discourse of that geotag is just people talking about Emily in Paris, people dressing like Emily in Paris, people recreating, re-semioticizing, re-embodying everything she does. Whereas at the Café de Flore, this was one thing that was happening in the discourse, but it was by no means as prominent as, say, just the use of the word Paris or the use of the word Café de Flore. I think there were 70 or so references to Emily, which is not insignificant, but not as significant as some of the other things I found in the data.
Thank you, Laurie. Now we have one question from my colleague Richard Phelan in the chat. What sort of control, if any, does the cafe exercise over this Instagram account?
Over this Instagram account. Okay, so keeping in mind that what I presented today was not an Instagram account, it was the geotag. And so one of my conclusions was that the way it asserts control over, because usually you would have no control over what the geotag looks like, because it's entirely sourced from Instagram users. You have total control over what your profile looks like. But a geotag, sort of like consumer reviews, are generated by those who go there, by the patrons. And so usually you don't really have much of control over what that looks like. However, one of the things that I'm sort of putting forward is that, in fact, they do maintain a huge amount of control because of the number of branded things that they put out when you go to the cafe. If you go to the cafe and you simply order a coffee and something to eat, a croissant, something small, they will bring a branded napkin. They'll bring a saucer for the coffee cup. They'll bring the coffee cup. They'll bring a plate for the baguette. They'll bring another plate. And so what happens is you order 2 things and you end up with 5 or 6 branded things on your table, plus the tablecloth and the branded table. And so when you take a photo, you're almost certain, it's almost impossible to obscure these elements. And then when you upload it to the geotag, that means there's this continuity, there's this homogeneity across the geotag that's being put there because the Café de Flore provides all of this semiotic material and really, like I said, floods the environment with it. And so that's how I believe that they are, in fact, exhibiting some control over this, even though usually it's not very possible to do so.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your question. Emma has a question for you.
Can you hear me? I'm assuming that you do then. I believe that you mentioned that you had discussions with participants, but what exactly did you discuss with them? Was it sort of their thought process behind posting those posts with the geotag, perhaps?
So I didn't conduct any interviews with these participants. What was interesting to me was to get their permission to use these photos. So anything that you see, for example, in the presentation, anytime you see a face, that user has allowed me to use their content, and everything that you'll see on the Instagram geotag has also been added by people who have released their photos to me. And so it's not something that's commonly done. And that was my principal communication with users. However, sometimes they did add things like, yeah, I went, but I feel like the cafe is really overrated. or I think the research is really interesting. I think it's really interesting the way Parisian people are portrayed, and the fact that I kind of want to be like them, but I kind of dislike it at the same time. So those were sort of spontaneous comments that were made that I didn't elicit, but that I suppose they thought might be elicited or they wanted to add. So I do always try to mention them at the end of my talks. Thank you for your question, because conducting interviews wasn't part of my research endeavor, considering just the vast number of posts that I collected.
Okay, so you got permission from every single person who posted something, like the 400 something people?
I do not have permission from the 408 people. So I have permission for anything that involves a person's body. If it's a photo of the table, I incorporate it in my presentation, but I don't attach any name to it. And I conduct analysis, but I don't publish them. Anything that gets published, I have permission for. Anything that goes on the Corpus de Flora account, I have permission for, and anything with a face, I have permission for. Those were the things I set out for myself. But in fact, legally, if you go through the GDPR, it's pretty surprising. You can actually use a lot of stuff legally, but I didn't want to set that as my only bar for how I use the data.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. We have a question from Abdelati.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I was particularly interested in how social media users try to prompt people to relate to their posts through subjectivity, the use of I and you, and telling stories, kind of, and like trying to be authentic and describing their quotidian, kind of. Could you expand on this maybe, because I find it just interesting? And do you know of any other strategies that Instagrammers or other social media platform users utilize to get their audience engaged?
Thank you for that question. Very interesting and very relevant question. I'd begin by stating that this notion of authenticity is somewhat endemic to Instagram. We consider it to be one of the first platforms where we saw that emerge as something that needed to happen in order for your content, or at least for certain types of influencers, less so micro celebrities, but certain types of influencers who are making their living from content creation. It was important for them to unlock that kind of perception. And so some of the strategies, in addition to these use of features such as use of language that's highly effective, these relatable overtones, we're asking questions directly to the invisible audience, this networked audience. So what do you eat for breakfast? Or would you go to Café de Flore? Have you ever been to Paris? Asking questions like this to sort of generate movement in the comments. And in fact, that's where it was employed quite frequently, not as frequently as hashtags, but you can certainly see that these users are aware of the value of comments being generated on their posts. However, during the data collection process was when saves kind of became a little bit more important for the algorithm. And so about halfway through, I started to see the discourse shift and users saying, if you want to go to Café de Flore, save this post. And so you can see how they're asking users to give them that recompense for the labor that they've put into the post if they've enjoyed it or found it useful. So I don't want to just say that they're like some kind of conniving strategy that's just used to self-gratifying ends. There's certainly something that contributes to the regimes of visibility that we have on the platform. But I also believe that it for many people, this is their type of labor, right? This is their work and their livelihood. And so it also seems understandable to, I think, to ask for that sort of recompense. And that's also why I employed that saving tactic, because I know it's somewhat beneficial to users. I hope I answered your question.
We definitely see that. Yeah, thank you for the answer. Like sometimes we get asked, like, can you do that? Like, could you do that? Or wouldn't you like to visit it? Or whatever, like using questions or exhibiting something cute or her or his dog or something. Yeah. Thank you for your answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question.
We have a question for you in the chat.
Okay.
Could you open the chat window
Yep.
from Sarah?
Sarah, okay. Hello, do you think that some people go to this cafe on purpose, knowing that posting a picture of their Parisian breakfast will attract an audience or allow them to get more likes? Absolutely. It is, while, like I said, I do believe the cafe is pushing its own brand and maintaining a certain amount of control, there is no way we can deny that this is absolutely something that can be commodified and used by people to gain acknowledgement, to gain status on the platform. It's very much a status symbol because you have to obviously travel to Paris to go there. So it's sort of a status symbol embedded in a status symbol. And what's really interesting as well is that you can see the people who have gone to the lengths to actually queue outside the cafe, because there's usually a very large queue outside of the cafe, and to actually sit down and consume something there, versus the sidewalk scenes, which often mean that people are not patrons of the cafe. They've literally come just to take the photo, to get the insignia, to get the background with the florals, and then to use that most often on their principal or cover photo, which I think also suggests the value of this place. And again, it's got this highly dominant, especially the storefront, this highly dominant kind of a semiotic component. It has a neon sign, it has all of these florals on top of it. So it's very, very visible. And when you go down the Boulevard Saint-Germain, you can see it from 500 meters away. I've tried to track it myself, being there physically, to see how far away you can see it. So it's already extremely visible physically, it's extremely visible historically, and so it just makes sense to use it as a resource and to align oneself with the pre-existing status, to kind of co-opt that status and see what happens. Thank you, Sarah.
Emily has a question.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. I'm in confetti too, so like it's kind of funny that I'm listening to this right now. But yeah, I have a question about, would you think that Café de Flore is the most relevant example regarding this process? I don't know if like relevant is the right word, but do you think there are places and geotags in Paris that are also like that have the same importance as the Café de Flore? And do you think that this process is particularly linked with cafes, or there are other places that show this kind of, I don't know if this process is the right word, but this kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Café de Flore stood out to me because it was a sort of very singular place. I thought about doing a study at the Eiffel Tower, at the Arc de Triomphe, at the Louvre, because you have a lot of different processes that go on, but these had kind of already been studied. That paper I put out, or I put forward in the 2014 paper by Thurlow and Jaworski, was done at the Tower of Pisa. And so it studied how people do that, the Pisa push. And I thought about that with the Louvre, the way people try to pinch it and make it look small in their photos. But I felt like that had, to an extent, sort of been visited. So I was looking for something that was new, and I was really looking for something that was using Instagram in a strategic way, but maybe not being so obvious about it. And so I couldn't find any other examples that were quite as salient, or at least as visible to me as Café de Flore. So I do think it's singular in that reason. And yes, I think there's something special about cafes and cafe culture. There's a sociologist named Ray Oldenburg who worked in the 1980s in America, and he talked about cafes and similar locations as things called third places. So places, and actually in French you have it tiers-lieux, and it comes from the same thing. And so they theorize it as these special places where people go specifically, right? You can drink a coffee at home, you can sit on a nice couch at home. So why do people leave? Why do people not just go from work to home and back? It's because these third places constitute unique social environments. People have physical social networks that are extremely linked to specific places. And so you can create this sort of identity nexus within a cafe culture. And so I definitely think that has a sway over the vibe, so to speak, and the way that this can now be mobilized and commandeered on Instagram.
Thank you, Emily, for your question. We have a question in the chat from Chloe.
Hello. Have you mainly presented examples of posts that were posted by women? Did you find that the discourses or linguistic characteristics of the posts were influenced by the gender of the user, or were they similar? So yes, Chloe, I'm glad you asked that, and I wonder if I can still share my screen because it might be helpful. Gosh, I don't know if I can do this. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. But yes, the corpus was extremely gendered, and I have some numbers here. So I really don't know what can be seen here. Up. Is this gonna work? It might work. Okay, so of the 408 posts, approximately 70% were constructed by women. It's very difficult to obtain fully accurate data, especially regarding gender identity. But for the most part, I think it's safe to presume, or I'm going to gender these contributors as women. And it is definitely a very feminine coded affinity space. And not just, we don't just have these contributors as women. I would say that in regard to your question, the linguistic features were perhaps a little bit less gendered, but certainly the multimodal semiotic features were incredibly gendered. And you get very visual salient displays of femininity and these kind of typified feminine ideals. You also have mentions about what is supposed to happen or not supposed to happen at Café de Flore. Here, this example says, my well-trained husband understood the assignment at Café de Flore. And so, yes, it was definitely a huge contribution to the corpus, and a bit surprising as well, because when I took a look at the numbers on Instagram, people in this demographic, so 25 to say 35, again, I'm making assumptions about ages, but that was presumably the principal demographic of my corpus. Most users in that age bracket are actually men of Instagram, which was a bit surprising to me. So the corpus very much rails against those norms by being constituted principally by women and having that very much on display. And there are a few papers that deal with feminine display as feminine self-representation on Instagram, and one by a woman named Bukowski, and she looks at Goffman's gender advertisements, and it's a very useful frame to consider, and you see a lot of recapitulation of these gender advertisements that were theorized by Goffman back in the 70s that are still happening today, these visual arrangements that clearly have some kind of societal pull because they're being reworked, reproduced all the time. One was feminine touch, which would be an example of like taking a picture of your coffee and having your hand in it. So these are tactics that have been used in advertisements going quite far back. So that's what I would say to your question. Slightly less on the lexical level, but definitely on the discursive level, very highly gendered.
Thank you, Chloe, for your question. Mathilde has a question for you.
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you very much for your presentation. That was really interesting. You talked earlier about the fact that people ask you a question about your data collection, and as soon as you start to answer, they seem to be less interested. And so I was just thinking about it because I'm starting to look at how do I have to collect my data and how do I have to explain that. And I wanted to know if you think that's the way of making it more interesting or more attractive in a sense, because, well, your the way you are gonna analyze everything and so on is based on this data, and it's part of the study in itself. So I think it's really interesting to look at it. And because I was talking about it with people, and they seem to be like, well, I don't really care about why did you choose to work on this post or this one or so on. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Sorry, just turning it down over here. I suppose I kind of misspoke there. I don't think that people are necessarily disinterested in it. I'm just aware that they don't have 3 years to dedicate to talking about it. But definitely, I think methodology is obviously the section that everyone kind of skips through if they're reading, unless they need to reproduce the methodology. It's not the bit that's considered the most interesting. But because when it comes to social media research methods, we do not have platform-specific methods, or if we do, they change in the blink of an eye. Take, for example, Twitter, which was definitely the platform that had the most kind of in-registered methods, reliable methods for data collection. You could use the API, and now all of that has gone out the window. So I think if you're in the research sector, it is interesting because it's a hurdle, right? That's what people say. And what got me thinking was, why do we keep calling these hurdles when it's just what the data is? Like the data changes, the data evolves. And so, okay, if a post gets deleted, which is what happened during that whole year of data collection, I had probably 700 posts over that total of the year, but they got changed, they were deleted, but it's fine. It's part of the data. It's how it works, and it teaches us something. And so I think when it comes to talking about it, maybe you saw my kind of approach is to try to make it as dynamic as possible, because it is dynamic data. And so if we present it in a kind of flat one-dimensional way, it's going to come across as flat and one-dimensional. Whereas if we make it move, we make it come alive, it better represents all of those affordances that are looped into that data. And I think it makes the methodological process much more interesting. Sure, there are things that are quite dry, like reading the GDPR, but at the same time, it offers a lot of room for interpretation. So I think it's interesting as well. I hope that encourages you somewhat.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mathilde. Laurie, I think, has a second question for you.
Hi, yes, I actually have 2 questions in one. I just first wanted to react on what you said earlier when you answered the very first question, I think, is that since some people are kind of disappointed in the Café de Flore, saying that it's overrated because of all the influence it has on social media, do you think that there could be a sort of counter semiotic being created online on Instagram to sort of like react but differently to the Café de Flore, instead of saying that it's superb and it's the real Parisian cafe, saying it's something else? And my second question is, since a cafe in real life is first a location where you socialize with people, where you go with your friends and you discuss and you interact with other people, don't you think that the advertisement of all those cafes on social media kind of make them lose their first sort of, let's say, function of socializing, but in real life rather than socializing on social media?
Okay, thank you for your questions. I'm going to try to retain them and respond in order. So in regards to the first one, yes, I definitely think that there can be, or maybe even now in 2023, is a stronger vein of counter discourse in a corpus. If I were to redo this study this year, I think it might be a little bit stronger, but it already exists in my corpus. I had this one contributor. She was the one who wrote the trilingual post about the cafe's napkin, who told me when we were talking that she thought it was overrated. However, in some of the captions, you can see there's one written in Italian where she says, Café de Flore, previously frequented by Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, now just frequented with influencers. But it hasn't lost its charm. So I think there's there's less of a challenging it and more of acknowledging it in my data set. However, on other spaces on Instagram, I've kind of tried to look around. I've looked a bit at Les Domingo because it's just, again, right beside it. They kind of have this history of competition. But when I've gone and looked, I haven't seen a lot of go to Domingo. It's the it's the Café de Flore on the DL, or it's the one people are, it's the cool place to go. I haven't seen so much of that, but that could just be when I was taking a look at it. However, it definitely wouldn't surprise me if elsewhere on Instagram there are cafes where people are saying, I went here because it's not Café de Flore, purposely kind of turning their back on that, which makes sense. But you definitely get a sense that people are aware of that and they talk about it, but they don't necessarily push or rail against it in the data. And I think it's because they still want that acknowledgement. They still want that gratification from Café de Flore. They want that like, they want the possibility of the repost. And that's probably not going to happen if they're criticizing the cafe outright rather than just like making a joke or making light of it. In terms of your second question, whether they lose their initial function, I would say yes, but I would also say almost every place that we go to and these spaces that we take up in our mediated experiences are all originally supposed to be sort of social interactions, and now all of our social interactions are virtually mediated by online communications. So this is a mediated experience. Right now, later if I go out and I go out for a drink, I might look at my phone. How different is that from what is being experienced at the cafe? I don't know. But certainly this idea of marketing themselves as an Instagrammable location does feel like they're taking on a new function. Perhaps not like they're not marketing themselves as losing their first function, but having gained one. So while you come and have a pose with a friend and you kick back and relax, you can also gain some followers. You can also get a nice picture for your feed. And so I think that's how they spin it. But definitely, Place de Café de Flore has, I think, massively, if you go and experience it, become a very carnival-esque, to use the Bakhtinian term, destination. But it's an interesting experience to have, and you can definitely see the culture clash there. This sort of new wave Insta celebrity and sort of old guard who go because they want to sit on the bench where Simone de Beauvoir sat, rather than just take a picture of it.
Thank you.
Jean has a question for you in the chat window.
Jean, how do you think my study has impacted or will impact the rate of Café de Flore? Well, if it ripples all the way to them, I do think some people have caught wind of it there because I had an interaction with a server who sort of acted like he knew what the project was, but I kind of didn't want to show all my cards because I want to come back and I want them to keep giving me really good seats where I can watch everything happening. But eventually, when I hope to write a book with all of this research. So when the book comes out, I mean, it'll probably be published by an academic publisher, which, isn't exactly making waves on the New York Times #1 list. But we'll see. I would say we'll see with time. But at the moment, it's a bit on the down low. But who knows? If it is impacting your perception of Café de Flore, then it's already had an impact somehow.
Thank you, Jean, for your question. Are there any other questions? You can post them in the chat. Raise your virtual hand, or are there any questions in X? I have a question for you.
Okay.
Actually, I would like to know, how did you manage to identify the languages of the different posts you collected?
Yeah, good question. It was very much a combination of multiple inquiries. So some of them I was able to identify outright because either I speak them or I read them. And so I would say about a third were very, more than that, probably half were very easily identifiable. And the other half, which have, things like written in the Cyrillic alphabet I used different sets of tools. So sometimes I would use DeepL to see what was translated back to me when I put it in, and then I would go on to, for example, Wikipedia pages written in of the Café de Flore written in that language and compare some of the keywords. But mostly I double checked with speakers of those languages just to be sure. And I didn't have any issues. They were all right, so that was quite good. But yeah, for like in Ukrainian and Russian, for example, there are different letters in the alphabet, so you can identify those letters and then identify which languages are being used.
Okay, so you used artificial intelligence.
I did. I used an LLM. I did use an LLM after my personal set of skills was exhausted, which it was exhausted fairly quickly, and then my friend's set of skills combined it with the two.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Feel free to ask them. Maya, there's a question in the chat. Thank you.
Maya, what advice would you give to someone interested in research on a topic that has to do with social media? There's so much to say, but I would say kind of what I talked about earlier. People have a lot of opinions about platforms, about their changing nature, about the type of data on them. And a lot of people, when, Twitter kind of went down the toilet, so to speak, and became X, a lot of people abandoned their research projects because they couldn't continue to use the same methods they employed. So sometimes it's for practical reasons. However, my advice, and I don't know if it would echo the advice of other researchers, would be that if you're really interested in a specific platform or a discourse genre on that platform, stick with it for the length of your project, no matter what happens, because all of those events are data. And not many people will see it through. And that means at the end, there aren't that many papers that are talking about what that experience was like, or what that methodological shift meant, or what they were able to uncover because of it. And so the literature won't be out there. And then one day somebody will be wanting to do that. And that paper will be of huge help to them. So I think would be see it through amidst all the changes. It's a bit of a rocky ocean sometimes, but I think that's what makes it interesting. So I always try to consider those hurdles as advantages rather than as just problems to circumvent. Try to go through them rather than get around them.
Laurie, have you got another question, or did you forget to, your virtual hand?
I think I forgot my virtual hand.
Laurie?
Yeah, I think I just forgot to take off the virtual hand.
Okay, thank
Sorry.
you. Yeah, doesn't matter. Are there any other questions? Zoe has a question.
Thank you for your presentation. As you would like to write a book about this work, would you consider to make like a comparative study with other significant places in Paris, like cake shops as La Durée, shopping malls as Galeries Lafayette, or maybe gardens like Jardin du Luxembourg, where we can perform a Parisian identity through an Instagram post? And if so, what kind of parameters would you take into account?
That's an excellent question, Zoe. Thank you. I think for this book, just because if you start kind of going in too many directions, it can lose the focus of the questions you're asking. I think the amount of research I have for this is probably enough to constitute a book just on the Café de Flore. However, I do have 2 side studies that I've been conducting. So either for papers in which I will mention the Café de Flore, or I just use it as a contextualizing variable. And the first of which I already spoke about, and that is the Emily in Paris study, where I gathered the data tagged at 3 geotags from the series: Emily's apartment, the restaurant, which is called Terranera in reality, and the Boulangerie Moderne. So I use those 3 to kind of contextualize specifically the Emily in Paris discourse and see how it's evolving at those geotags, which previously basically were fairly unused on the platform and have massively expanded versus the Café de Flore, which includes this discourse genre, but is by no means has its identity being co-opted by that discourse genre entirely. So that's kind of one way I would situate it. And the other study I did, and I presented for Grégoire's day at the Maison Française d'Oxford, which looks at how Instagram posts using the lexical token Parisian are used in Vogue articles. And so that's more of like the offline part of the online nexus, to see how they're represented and also see how the reach of a specific perception of Parisian, and specifically Parisian women, because very often when we say Parisian, what's being indexed is a woman, not a gender neutral figure. And so that is the kind of other contextualizing study I've set out to do. I haven't set out to look at Jardin de Luxembourg, Galerie Lafayette, or any of those other places, simply because of honestly the sheer number of people that go through there, and because on Instagram all of the data collection has to be manual if you want to comply with the ethical terms of use. You have to do it all by hands. You can't scrape the data, and so you also have to consider the quantity that you're working through. I mean, it took me a whole year to kind of gather those posts, and I'd say that was the right amount of time for something as large as 400 to 700 posts to be analyzing them, etc. But it's a very interesting question, and if I could, I would certainly look at as many places as possible. But those are the ones I kind of chose to do.
Thank you for your answer. I didn't understand. Did you already publish the study about Emily's in Paris and Oxford?
No, I haven't published that study. I did publish a paper fairly recently that talks a little bit about what I talked about today. So if you want to look at that, you can. The Emily in Paris study, I'm hoping to send it in by the end of the year. And then the Oxford Vogue study will probably come sometime at the end of next year. It's I've developed that project a little bit less than I've developed the Emily in Paris project. Because I also have consenting participants already for the Emily in Paris project. So it's a little bit more on the forefront.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe, for your question. Jean posted another question in the chat.
What was the main issue you faced while conducting this research? Good question, Jean. There are so many I could name. I would say one of the main issues came with how I was going to deal with consent, because I wanted ideally to get consent from everyone, but that is just it's not possible. So deciding legally, I actually had quite a bit of free reign, as I mentioned, but trying to carve out those parameters, because they felt to some extent pointless in a way. Okay, who's to say what constitutes a body part, what constitutes identifying someone? And so when I finally settled on this idea of faces or very salient displays of the body being one of the features that contribute to that. But in fact, some of the tabletop scenes as well, in fact, many of them are from consenting participants as well. But I would say that's definitely one thing I spent a lot of time mulling over, a lot of lost sleep over that. And also just a fun fact, which is that I used In Vivo, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a really good resource for coding data like this. And you can also code videos. They had a bug, but they fixed it. Anyway, it's a really good resource, but it lost a bunch of my coding, and I had to go back and do like 6 months worth of coding, which was a real drag. So that I would say that was definitely one of the issues, but you come out stronger on the other side, or at least you come out still alive. Perhaps not as strong, perhaps just convincing yourself you are.
Abdelhadi has a second question for you.
Yes, unfortunately for you, it is related to the biggest problem you faced during your research.
That's
It is
okay.
related to that.
Like
So
I said, I'm on the other side.
so there was ethical questions raised by people modifying their posts, right? The fact that they can modify the multi-modality, shareability, adjustability of their post raised questions. I do not fully grasp how. Maybe if you can explain a little bit. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that posed ethical questions, that posed methodological, what people might say methodological or analytical hurdles, right? What do you do if you've been conducting analysis and especially at the beginning where you only have a small set of data, something really interesting pops up and then that post gets deleted. Or you have a really interesting caption and then a month later it's changed. That was the principal issue for me. So I think there is an ethical component, which is if I have this data and somebody removed it from the platform, do I still have the right to use it? My decision was to the shortest limit for the study was 1 month. The post had to be on the platform for 1 month before it was extracted on December 31st, 2022. But obviously the post tagged on January 1st had a whole year to evolve. So 12 months, 11 months, descending all the way down to 1 month. So there may well be data that photos, that's why I don't always publish captions from non-consenting individuals because those could have changed. But for the most part, if my consenting participants decide to change their captions, they know that I've preserved the original one, or when I put everything on the corpus de fleur, it will be updated at that point. So I would say yes, there's an ethical component, but mostly it's a methodological issue. What do you do when your data changes? And my response was let it change and then fix a date where you're going to say, okay, I will have studied it from this time. These are the changes that happen, and then that's what I'm presenting. I'm not presenting the data necessarily as it exists today. I'm presenting as it existed on December 31st, 2022.
I see. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you, Abdelhadi. Camille in the chat has a question for you.
Hello, could you explain the origins of cafe culture? Oof. Difficult to do. I would say cafe culture, cafes have obviously, I mean, existed in 18th century is kind of when they kind of start to appear. Cafe culture, I would say around the 19th century, but cafe culture, as I was kind of talking about with flânerie, I think at its origins involves a certain privilege. So we're sort of talking about an upper class scenario versus a pub, which historically would have been a middle class or lower class gathering space, because it's the idea of people having the time to just go somewhere in the middle of the day and have this essence to spend money, to again dedicate their time to spending however long at that cafe. So while that doesn't necessarily speak to the origins of it, perhaps it can tell you a little bit about the kind of symbolic ideals that cradle it and that form what we have today, where cafes are very much now democratic spaces, but you can perhaps see that aesthetic of a little bit an upper class aesthetic co-opted in certain more historical cafes versus contemporary cafes, which might adopt a different approach. I'm sorry, I can't respond more thoroughly to your question.
Is there another question before the end of this session today?
And I'd just like to say, if anybody does have further questions or you're interested in working on Instagram, you can always find my email address online, and I'm really happy to answer questions or advise to the extent that I can on projects being conducted there, because it's not always a simple task.
So there's a question from Chloe.
Did you ever consider studying this cafe on other social media platforms? Not really, because this geolocation figure or function is so necessary for my study, and there aren't all that many active social media platforms where I can study the geographical tagging component or affordance. I could have looked up hashtag Café de Fleur on Twitter to see what the discourse is there, but again, that involves different platform norms, different platform vernaculars, and I think that muddles the study a bit. It's interestingly, anecdotally, and you could certainly execute a comparative study, but because we still know relatively little about social media platforms, and because they're constantly changing and evolving, it's interesting to situate a study, and I think that's why it's most often done on one singular platform, because it's giving us more ideas about what these platform-specific norms and platform-specific vernaculars really are, and also how they're changing in the short span, for example, in the 10 years that Instagram has been around.
Thank you. So I will conclude, I suppose. Once again, my warmest thanks to our keynote speaker today, Erin. Thank you very much, Erin.
Pleasure.
And thank you also to the audience, either in Aix-en-Provence or on Zoom. I will give you some information about the next session of the ISSMDA seminar. It will deal with ChatGPT and its impact on research in higher education. I will welcome Alexandre Geffen from the French CNRS in Aix-en-Provence on the 29th of January from 3 p.m. French time. It will also be a hybrid session, so you will have the possibility to follow this event either on-site in Aix or with Zoom. The title of this talk in French will be Intelligence artificielle et recherche en SHS, le cas ChatGPT. Thank you very much to everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.